In a bustling office building on the edge of the city, there was a department that everyone considered essential. It was a busy and demanding environment, and every day, the employees worked long hours to ensure things went smoothly. At the heart of this department was a man named Greg, the manager. Greg was proud of the work his team did and always believed that the success of the department was a reflection of his leadership. He was confident in his decisions and carried himself like someone who always knew best. Greg believed that his department was one of the most important in the entire company. Every day, Greg would walk into the office with a sense of purpose. He liked to keep an eye on everything, making sure that no task was left undone, and that everyone was working to their fullest potential. His attention to detail was something that his team admired, but it also made him a bit rigid. Greg didn't like distractions and was always focused on the next task at hand. But there was one person in the building who didn't get the same attention. Her name was Clara, and she worked as the office janitor. Clara wasn't an employee who stood out in the way that Greg did. She wasn't part of the busy team that worked under the pressure of deadlines. Clara didn't wear a suit or carry a briefcase. Instead, she wore her work clothes, a simple uniform that allowed her to do the cleaning that made the office look pristine. Most of the staff didn't pay much attention to Clara. She was often seen quietly pushing her cleaning cart down the hallways, sweeping or mopping in corners, or wiping down tables in the break room. To them, she was just the janitor, a worker who made sure the office was tidy, but little else. People greeted her with a simple hello, but no one really took the time to get to know her. Clara didn't mind. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of her work. Her job was simple but important. Without her, the office would be messy, and that would make everyone's day harder. She took pride in keeping everything clean, making sure everything looked fresh for the employees. But Clara had more on her mind than most people knew. As for Greg, he didn't think much about Clara either. He often walked past her, completely unaware of who she really was. To him, she was just another employee, one who helped keep the place in order, but not someone who played a role in the bigger picture. Greg was busy, focused on running his department, and he didn't think much beyond his own responsibilities. His world was full of meetings, spreadsheets, and trying to keep everything running perfectly. But little did Greg know, Clara's role in the building was much more significant than he could have ever imagined. As he walked past her, he didn't realize that the very person he had just ignored could be the one who would change his life in ways he never expected. Clara wasn't just a janitor. She was someone who had a job that could make or break his future, though he had no idea. The office was about to face a turning point, and it all started with a simple moment. Greg, the proud manager, turning down Clara's request for a lunch break. Clara returned to her cleaning tasks with a quiet sigh, trying to push the frustration away. She had been expecting a simple yes to her request for a lunch break, something she'd never had trouble with before. But today was different. Today, Greg, the manager, had brushed her off without a second thought. It wasn't the first time she'd been ignored, but something about this moment stung more than usual. She had worked hard that morning, cleaning the offices, dusting the furniture, and scrubbing the floors. The office was spotless, yet Clara's quiet work often went unnoticed. To most of the employees, she was just the janitor, the one they saw pushing a cleaning cart around, wiping down the counters, or taking out the trash. Nobody ever seemed to wonder about her life beyond her job. She didn't mind, of course. Clara wasn't one to seek attention. She preferred to keep to herself, quietly doing her job, as she always had. But today, the dismissal had felt different. Greg's words had felt cold, dismissive. She had asked politely, just as she always did, and yet he had acted as if her request wasn't important enough to consider. Clara's disappointment wasn't about the lunch break itself. It was about how easily Greg had dismissed her. It was as if she didn't matter, like she was invisible. She tried to shake off the feeling and continued with her work. She moved down the hall, her cleaning cart rolling quietly behind her. The office was filled with the hum of conversations and the tapping of keyboards, but to Clara, it felt distant. She had always enjoyed her work, but today her thoughts kept drifting back to Greg and the way he had treated her. She was just the janitor to him, nothing more. As she walked, Clara couldn't help but wonder how things would have been if she were in a different role. What if she were one of the managers or a high-ranking employee? Would she have been treated differently then? But those thoughts quickly faded as she reminded herself that she didn't want to be seen as someone who complained. She was grateful for her job. It provided her with the means to live and pay her bills. But still, the disappointment lingered in her chest. As the day wore on, Clara pushed her cart through the hallways, cleaning as she always did. She made sure the floors were spotless, the trash was emptied, and the bathrooms were fresh and tidy. No matter how small the task, she completed it with care. This was her work, and she took pride in it. Even if nobody else noticed, she knew she had done her best. Meanwhile, Greg continued with his busy schedule, unaware of the effect his words had on Clara. He moved from meeting to meeting, taking calls, and making decisions. In his mind, everything was going according to plan. His department was running smoothly, and his staff seemed to be doing well. The last thing on his mind was the quiet janitor who had asked for a lunch break. But Clara's quiet disappointment was the first crack in the calm that was about to unfold. It was a small moment, a brief interaction, but it was a turning point. Clara may have been quiet and reserved, but she wasn't invisible. Soon, Greg would learn just how wrong he was to underestimate her. Clara walked back down the hallway with her cleaning cart, her steps slower than usual. The words Greg had said kept repeating in her mind. No time for breaks today. It wasn't just about the lunch break. It was the way he had dismissed her so quickly, as if she didn't matter at all. She had always tried to be polite and patient, but this felt different. She felt small, almost invisible in his eyes. It wasn't that Clara was asking for much. Everyone needed a break now, and then even Greg. But for some reason, he had seemed annoyed by her request. Maybe he was just stressed, she thought. The department had been busy lately, and Greg had been working hard too. But it still didn't seem fair. Clara had worked through her shift without much rest, cleaning the office, taking care of the small details that everyone overlooked. This was her job, and she took pride in it. Yet, the manager had refused her the simplest courtesy. As she continued with her tasks, Clara found herself thinking about all the times she had been overlooked. She wasn't one to complain. She knew what she signed up for when she took the janitorial job. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't a role that brought her attention. Most people didn't even notice her as she moved through the halls. She was just the person who kept the office clean. But deep down, Clara wished for a little respect, even if it came from people like Greg, who held positions of power in the company. Clara had worked at the company for a few years now, always doing her job without asking for much in return. She knew the office inside and out, the little spots that needed extra attention, and the areas where dust could hide. Every day, she made sure that the office looked presentable and clean, and no one ever seemed to mind. It was a job that didn't bring attention or praise. But Clara didn't mind. It was what she was good at, and it was enough for her. But today, the rejection hurt. She didn't want to make a scene, so she simply nodded and walked away. But inside, she felt a sting. It was as though her role as the janitor made her invisible, as if her needs didn't matter to the people around her. Even when she worked hard and tried to do her best, there were times when it seemed like no one cared. Despite the disappointment, Clara did what she always did. She pushed the feelings aside and focused on the work at hand. She cleaned the kitchen, wiped down counters, and made sure the restrooms were fresh and tidy. These were the tasks she was used to, and they kept her busy. Her work was important, even if no one ever noticed. She reminded herself of that as she moved through the office, making sure everything was in order. Meanwhile, Greg remained busy in his office, unaware of how his brief exchange with Clara had affected her. He was focused on a presentation he needed to prepare and had no time to think about the janitor's lunch break. He moved through the afternoon, confident in his role and sure that everything was going smoothly in his department. Little did he know that the simple rejection of a lunch break was about to lead to much bigger consequences. Clara finished her tasks for the day, still feeling the weight of the encounter with Greg. But she didn't let it stop her. She quietly finished her shift, knowing that her work would be recognized eventually, even if it wasn't today. The next morning, Greg was already in the office early, getting ready for his first meeting of the day. The department was busy as usual, and he felt confident that everything was under control. He had no time to waste on distractions. His focus was on the presentation he was preparing, as well as on keeping his department running smoothly. Everything seemed normal, and he was sure it would be another typical day. Clara, as always, arrived on time to begin her shift. She walked through the office quietly, pushing her cleaning cart, as she had done every day. She started with the break room, wiped down the tables, and emptied the trash bins. It was a calm morning, and most of the employees were just starting to arrive. As Clara moved from one task to the next, she kept her head down and focused on her work. Greg passed her a few times during the morning, nodding in her direction but not stopping to speak. He had no reason to think anything was unusual. He was busy with his own tasks, checking emails, and preparing for a meeting with senior management. He still hadn't given much thought to the incident the day before. To him, it was just a simple moment. He hadn't intended to offend Clara, but that didn't mean he was thinking about it anymore. However, everything was about to change. During the late morning, the office was filled with the usual hum of activity when Greg saw something unexpected. A few employees were talking quietly in the corner, and Greg overheard part of their conversation. One of them mentioned the inspection that had taken place the previous day. Greg froze for a moment. The word inspection made him stop and pay attention. Inspection, Greg thought. He looked around and saw Clara walking down the hallway, pushing her cart. She had been working all morning, just like she always did. But now he noticed something he had never noticed before. She wasn't just a janitor. She was someone important. A colleague standing nearby noticed Greg's confused look and explained, "You didn't know. Clara is an inspector from the corporate office. She's been assigned to evaluate the departments." Greg's eyes widened in surprise. "An inspector?" he asked, his voice quiet. The colleague nodded. "Yes. She's not just the janitor. Clara has been sent to assess the departments. She's in charge of making sure everything is up to standard." Greg's mind raced as he realized the truth. The woman he had so casually dismissed, the one he had denied a lunch break, wasn't just a cleaner. She was an official inspector sent to evaluate his department. Greg's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe it. How had he not known this? How had he missed such an important detail about Clara? He looked at her again, this time with new eyes. Clara had always kept to herself, quietly doing her job without asking for much attention. But now, Greg saw her differently. She wasn't just the quiet janitor who cleaned up after everyone. She had the authority to make decisions that could change everything. Clara walked past Greg's office, unaware that he now knew the truth. She continued to go about her work, just as she always did. But for Greg, the realization hit hard. He had no idea what to expect next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had just made a big mistake by underestimating Clara. The atmosphere in the office felt different after Greg learned who Clara really was. He kept trying to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to her. How could he have missed such an important detail? How could he have brushed off the very person who was in charge of inspecting the entire department? Greg tried to shake the thought, but it lingered in the back of his mind, making him uneasy. Clara, meanwhile, continued with her usual routine. She moved through the office with the same quiet efficiency, wiping down surfaces, mopping floors, and making sure everything was in order. To everyone around her, it seemed like any other day. But Clara's role had shifted. She was now on the clock as an inspector, and she wasn't just cleaning anymore. She was watching, taking notes, and silently assessing every corner of the office. Greg's nervousness grew as the morning passed. He had always prided himself on his attention to detail, on running a tight ship. But now, with Clara observing, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something he had missed. Was everything as perfect as he thought? Was his department really running as smoothly as it appeared? At one point, Greg decided to step out of his office for a short break. He needed to clear his head and think things through. As he walked down the hallway, he spotted Clara again. She was busy wiping down the windows in the break room. Greg hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. Should he apologize for his earlier reaction? Should he try to make small talk? But Clara was in the middle of her work, and he didn't want to interrupt. So he simply nodded at her as he passed by. Clara didn't look up. She continued working as if she hadn't noticed him. But inside, she was aware of his presence. She had always been quiet, and she had learned to observe the people around her without drawing attention to herself. Today, though, she was more focused than ever before. She had a job to do, and nothing was going to stop her from completing it. As the morning wore on, Clara moved from one task to another, inspecting the condition of the restrooms, checking the cleanliness of the common areas, and ensuring that every corner of the office met the company's standards. She didn't rush. She took her time, making sure she didn't overlook anything. There were small details that many people wouldn't notice, like the dust on the tops of shelves or the crumbs left behind in the break room. But Clara noticed them all. Greg, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about his department's performance. The more he thought about it, the more he began to feel nervous. Was his team really doing their best? Was everything truly in top shape? The questions kept running through his mind, and he began to second-guess every decision he had made recently. He had never been worried about his department before, but now, with Clara watching every move, he felt a sense of pressure he had never experienced. The fear of failure began to creep in. What if the inspection didn't go well? What if Clara found something wrong that he hadn't noticed? By lunchtime, Clara had finished her first round of inspections. She gathered her notes, making sure everything was recorded. She had seen enough to form an initial opinion, but there was still more to evaluate. Clara was methodical, and she would not rush through the process. It was clear that Greg wasn't the only one who had a lot to think about. As the afternoon wore on, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Clara and the inspection. He knew it was his job to make sure everything ran smoothly, but now, with Clara quietly observing, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anxiety. What if she found something wrong? What if his department wasn't up to standard? Greg was a man who took pride in his work. He believed in keeping things organized, efficient, and running like a well-oiled machine. But the more he thought about Clara's presence, the more he started questioning every little detail. Was everything in perfect condition? Was there anything he missed? He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this uneasy. He stood in front of his desk, staring at his computer screen, but the words on the page blurred together. His mind was racing, and every little noise in the office seemed amplified. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Everything felt louder, more intense. Greg decided to step away from his desk for a moment. He needed a break. He walked out of his office and into the hallway, hoping a short walk would help clear his mind. But as he walked past the break room, he saw Clara again. She was standing by the windows, quietly wiping them down. Greg felt a knot form in his stomach. For some reason, her presence made him feel even more anxious. He paused for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should he say something? Should he try to make small talk? But before he could make up his mind, Clara looked up and met his eyes. She gave him a polite nod, but she didn't say anything. Greg nodded back, but he could feel the awkwardness between them. As he walked away, Greg couldn't help but wonder if Clara was silently judging him, if she was taking notes on everything she saw. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He had always been in control, always confident in his position. But now, with Clara observing him, He felt like he was under a magnifying glass. Later in the afternoon, Clara finished her rounds. She had seen everything she needed to see. She had made her notes, checked off her checklist, and recorded her findings. Greg didn't know it yet, but Clara had already formed an opinion about the department. She had noticed the small things, the areas that needed improvement, the things that were overlooked. Clara wasn't looking to cause trouble. She was just doing her job. She understood that every department had its flaws, and her goal was to help make things better. But Greg didn't know that. To him, the inspection felt like a test, one he wasn't sure he was passing. By the time the workday was winding down, Greg had worked himself into a bit of a frenzy. He had tried his best, but the fear of failure kept nagging at him. He was waiting for Clara to approach him with her feedback, but she hadn't said anything. She had kept to herself all day, just like she always did. It wasn't until the end of the day, when everyone was packing up to leave, that Greg received the first hint of what was to come. Clara was standing near the door, gathering her cleaning supplies. She looked up and met his gaze once again. "Mr. Greg," Clara said quietly, her tone calm and neutral, "I'll have the report ready for you tomorrow." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He nodded, but inside, he was anxious about what the report would say. Would it be good, or would it reveal his mistakes? The next morning, Greg arrived at the office earlier than usual. He had spent most of the night tossing and turning, unable to shake the anxiety about Clara's inspection. He had tried to focus on other things, but all he could think about was what Clara might have found. The more he thought about it, the more he started to worry. Was his department really as perfect as he had thought? Had he missed something? Greg tried to push the thoughts aside, but they kept coming back. He needed to be prepared for whatever Clara was going to say. If there were any problems, he had to fix them immediately. But what if it was worse than he thought? What if Clara's report revealed things he couldn't ignore? The office slowly filled with the usual bustle as employees began arriving for their day. Greg walked into his office and sat down at his desk, trying to act normal. He went through his emails and reviewed some reports, but his mind kept drifting. He glanced at the clock, and before he knew it, the morning had passed. At around 11 a.m., Clara walked into his office. She was carrying a folder, her face calm and unreadable. Greg looked up, his heart racing. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. "Good morning, Mr. Greg," Clara said quietly, her voice steady. "I have the inspection report ready for you." Greg stood up, trying to hide his nervousness. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice sounding more tense than he intended. He reached out to take the folder, but Clara didn't immediately hand it over. Instead, she paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "I've made a full report on the condition of the department," Clara said, her tone professional. "There are some areas that could use improvement, but nothing major. Overall, I think your team is doing well." Greg's heart seemed to stop for a moment. He had expected worse. He had imagined the report would be filled with complaints and problems, but Clara was saying there wasn't anything major. His shoulders relaxed slightly, but he still felt uneasy. Clara handed him the folder, and Greg took it with a shaky hand. He opened the folder and began scanning the pages. Clara had written down a list of observations, and Greg quickly realized that the problems she had noticed were small but important. Some of the notes were about areas that needed better organization. A few of the filing systems were outdated and difficult to navigate. A few small areas of the office needed more frequent cleaning, like the corners of the break room and the shelves in the storage closet. But none of these things were major enough to justify shutting down the department. Greg breathed a sigh of relief. The report wasn't as bad as he had feared. Still, there were areas for improvement, and he knew he needed to act quickly. It wasn't enough to just be good enough. He wanted his department to be perfect. "I'll make sure these issues are addressed," Greg said, looking up from the report. "Thank you, Clara. I'll get to work on it right away." Clara nodded, her face remaining neutral. "I'm glad to hear that. The small changes can make a big difference in the long run. Overall, though, you're doing a good job." Greg felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had been so worried about the report, but Clara's feedback was encouraging. It wasn't just a list of things he had done wrong. It was an opportunity to improve, to make his department even better. As Clara left his office, Greg sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief. The tension he had been carrying all week slowly began to fade. He still had work to do, but for now, he could breathe a little easier. The inspection had not been a disaster, and he had learned valuable lessons from it. Greg looked at the report one last time, determined to address the small issues Clara had pointed out. He knew that he had been given a chance to improve, and he wasn't going to waste it. The next few days passed quietly in the office, but for Greg, things felt different. He had taken Clara's feedback to heart, working through the small improvements she had suggested. Some changes were simple, like reorganizing a few filing cabinets and adding extra cleaning to areas that often got overlooked. Other changes, like improving communication within the team, would take more time, but Greg was determined to make them happen. His department was beginning to run more smoothly. Greg could feel the difference. He felt more organized, and even his team seemed to be working more efficiently. Despite the minor setbacks, the overall atmosphere was improving. But as Greg settled into his new routine, he couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Every time he saw Clara, he remembered the awkward moment when he had dismissed her request for lunch. It had been a small mistake, but it had been one he couldn't undo. He hadn't apologized for it yet, and he felt that he should. One afternoon, Greg walked past Clara in the hallway. She was busy cleaning the windows, as always, moving with quiet precision. For a moment, he hesitated. Should he say something? Should he finally apologize for the way he had treated her? He had no idea how she would respond, but he knew that he needed to make things right. He took a deep breath and walked up to her. Clara looked up from her work and gave him a small smile, but her expression remained neutral. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't giving him an easy way in either. "Clara, Greg began, but he wasn't sure how to finish. He wasn't the type of person to admit his mistakes easily, but something about Clara's calm presence made him realize that he needed to own up to what he had done. "I just wanted to apologize for the way I treated you the other day," Greg said, his voice more sincere than he had intended. "I shouldn't have dismissed your request for a lunch break like that. You deserve respect, and I didn't show that. I'm sorry." Clara stopped what she was doing and gave him a thoughtful look. She had always been a quiet person, but she was quick to recognize sincerity. She could see that Greg was being genuine, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't often that people apologized to her, but Greg's words were different. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "I appreciate that. I know you're busy, and I didn't take it personally, but I'm glad you said something." Greg nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time since the incident, he felt like he had done the right thing. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about realizing that every person in the office, no matter their role, deserved to be treated with respect. Clara returned to her cleaning, and Greg continued on his way, but something had changed between them. There was no longer any awkwardness, no lingering tension. They had acknowledged the misunderstanding and moved past it. Greg spent the rest of the day working with a lighter heart, his mind focused on the tasks ahead. He knew that things were far from perfect, but they were improving, and that was what mattered most. The small mistakes he had made were lessons, and the changes he had implemented were steps toward making his department even better. After the conversation with Clara, Greg felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in days. The awkwardness that had been lingering between them was gone, and he could finally focus on his work without feeling the weight of guilt on his shoulders. It was a small moment, but it had made a big difference. Greg knew he had made the right decision by apologizing, and it felt good to have that weight lifted. Over the next few weeks, things continued to improve in Greg's department. The small changes Clara had suggested were being put into action, and the office was running more efficiently than ever. The filing systems were now organized, the communication within the team had improved, and the office was cleaner and more welcoming. Greg was proud of the progress they had made, but he also knew that this wasn't the end. There was always room for improvement, and he was determined to keep working hard to make things even better. Clara, for her part, continued to go about her work quietly and efficiently, just as she always had. She wasn't seeking recognition or praise, but the office seemed to have a renewed sense of respect for her. People who had once ignored her now acknowledged her with a smile or a friendly greeting. The employees had begun to see her in a new light, not just as the janitor, but as someone whose observations and suggestions were valuable. As for Greg, he had learned an important lesson through this experience. He had always been so focused on his own responsibilities that he had overlooked the contributions of others. But now he understood that every person in the office, no matter their role, had something valuable to offer. Clara had proven that, and it had changed the way he saw things. One afternoon, as Greg walked through the office, he caught sight of Clara again. She was cleaning the windows in the break room. And this time, instead of walking past without a word, Greg stopped to talk to her. "Clara," he said, "I just wanted to thank you again for the feedback. It really helped us improve." Clara smiled, but this time there was a sense of mutual respect in the air. "I'm glad I could help," she replied. "It's been good to see the department improving." Greg nodded, feeling a sense of pride. He had made mistakes, but he had learned from them. The department was better now, and he had learned how to treat others with more respect. It wasn't just about managing a team. It was about recognizing the value that every person brought to the table. As the days passed, Greg's confidence grew, but he never forgot the lesson he had learned. He made it a point to treat everyone in the office with kindness and respect, regardless of their role. Clara had reminded him that the smallest actions could have a big impact, and that respect and appreciation should be shown to everyone, no matter their job. In the end, it wasn't just the department that had improved, it was Greg as well. He had grown as a manager and as a person. And as for Clara, she continued to do her job quietly, knowing that she had made a difference, even if it wasn't always obvious. In her own way, she had helped Greg see the bigger picture, and that was something she could be proud of.